Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Richard Nephew. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. I'm joined today by four outstanding speakers who I will introduce in just a moment. This morning, we are going to talk about the future of nuclear energy. Our point of departure will be three papers that the Center on Global Energy Policy is releasing this week, each of which covers a facet of this issue, from the science to policy to global geopolitics. For those joining us at Columbia, we in fact have a sneak peek of the exec summaries for each of these papers at the table that you passed as you were walking in. And for everyone else, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait until the papers are released in a couple of days. But I expect our conversation to go much, much farther, particularly given the news this morning about Westinghouse filing for bankruptcy, which I think puts a lot of the issues that we were planning to talk about into sharp relief. Let me first say quickly that this event, like all those at the Center, is being webcast live, and both the full video and podcast recording will be available on our website and on iTunes in the coming days. And for those of you watching online, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question for the panelists at any time using the hashtag CGEPevents and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy, or my personal handle, Richard M. Nephew. I'll be checking that periodically as we proceed. I know that I've been joined by four guests. First, we have Dr. Andrew Caddick. Andy is the former president of Yankee Atomic Electric Company and professor of practice at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He continues to consult on nuclear operations, advanced nuclear power plants, and policy and regulatory matters in the United States. He also serves as the senior nuclear safety oversight boards in China. He is a graduate at MIT from the Nuclear Science and Engineering Department. Second, Mr. Tim Frazier. Tim is a former Department of Energy career employee with almost 23 years of experience working with and managing nuclear programs for the department. He served at senior levels in the department's Office of Nuclear Energy. During the Bush administration, he was a senior technical advisor, and during the Obama administration, he was the designated federal officer for the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. He is currently a nuclear consultant working with clients on nuclear waste policy, nuclear energy policy, nonproliferation, community involvement and communications, and space nuclear power systems. Third, Dr. Nicola de Blasio. Nicola is now a non-resident senior fellow at the Center, having served as the program director for technology and innovation for the past 2 years. Prior to joining us, he was vice president of R&D, international development at Eni, the Italian energy firm, where he was also responsible for startup evaluation group and engineered the strategic value creating partnerships with world-leading universities. Fourth, Dr. Patricia Culligan. Trish is a professor of civil engineering at the Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science here at Columbia University. Her principal fields of interest include geoenvironmental engineering, porous media flow and transport, urban sustainability, and geotechnical centrifuge modeling. She is the author or co-author of over 100 technical articles, including 2 books, 3 book chapters, and over 60 refereed journal and conference proceedings. As I said, today we are going to discuss the future of nuclear energy, with our conversation beginning with the review of the 3 papers being released by the Center on Global Energy Policy this week. These papers and the research that led to them was funded by a generous grant provided by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. The objective of the grant was to examine the technical and policy factors in nuclear energy, to identify common themes, issues, and challenges, and to offer recommendations and views as to how to overcome those challenges and issues. We will begin with the first paper that we commissioned, a comparison of advanced nuclear technologies by Andy. After he has offered a few thoughts and conclusions from his work, we will turn things over to Tim, who will present the main conclusions and recommendations from his paper on the role of policy in reviving and expanding U.S. global nuclear leadership. And then I will turn over the floor to Nicola, who will brief on our joint paper on the geopolitics of nuclear power and technology. And last, but very much not least, I will invite Trish to offer her thoughts on the subject writ large, as well as any observations or critiques of the papers that we have presented. Depending on how much time we have left, I will then either take the moderator's privilege to ask a few questions of my own, or I will open the floor to questions from the audience. As I noted at the beginning, I will also be checking Twitter from time to time in order to make questions available from anyone watching online. I will not be monitoring the Premier League or any other soccer scores that might come in. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to Andy.
Thank you very much. When I first started this project, I thought it was going to be relatively simple. You know, there's only a few reactors out there. We can kind of summarize them very quickly. Unfortunately, for me, it became quite a Herculean task. When you'll see the report, I reviewed over or close to 40 new and current nuclear reactor designs being developed in the world. Many of them are in the United States. Quite a few are in China. And the technologies range from the light water reactors, which we're all familiar with, small size to very large, 1,200 megawatt plants, helium-cooled gas reactors, liquid metal-cooled reactors by sodium, lead, or lead bismuth, molten salt-cooled reactors, molten salt-fueled reactors, which means the fuel is in a liquid form, small modular reactors, which are apparently coming into serious discussion, and microreactors, which are about 1 or 2 megawatts. So as you can see, the plethora of choices are many. And one of the questions I was asked by the team here was, look at these reactors from a safety point of view, look at them from a proliferation, non-proliferation point of view, look at them from an economics point of view, and also from a waste management point of view. And as I said, this task became very, very Herculean. In terms of some of the key findings, 45 nations are considering new nuclear power stations, 45. There's over 50 new technologies being considered. The countries that are most active in new reactors are China and Russia and Korea. Climate change, not competitive costs, are the main drivers in building new nuclear power plants. Many innovative non-light water reactors are under development, as I mentioned. The problem with nuclear, unfortunately, is its very high capital cost. Small modular reactors are supposed to be the answer to that because the initial investment is smaller. They can afford these small modular reactors. Also, there is little credit given for the long-term investment that is needed for nuclear power. These reactors are supposed to last for 40 and some new ones for 60 years. And that is not valued very much in the current marketplace. To reduce costs, the developers are increasing the size of the power plant to make the cost per kilowatt hour lower. To reduce the investment, reactors are being made smaller modular reactors. Unfortunately, the cost per kilowatt hour is higher. So you're caught in between two very difficult choices. The development cost and regulatory costs for new reactors, especially non-traditional, non-water reactors, is extremely high and prohibitively expensive. Proliferation concerns generally need to be addressed politically, not technically. In my belief, based on years of examining this question, there is no technical solution to proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation. For sustainability, fast reactors, reactors that require reprocessing, are going to be needed for the nuclear option. Clearly, a new regulatory regime is also going to be needed because, especially for innovative reactors, where you cannot license them under the old prescriptive way of doing business as is found in the United States. The challenge for new nuclear plants does not appear to be safety, but cost. One comment about new nuclear construction, and that is we've had obviously some issues relative to Westinghouse going bankrupt. And one would say, well, gee whiz, if this continues in the future, no one's ever going to build another nuclear power plant. My answer to that question is this is a first-of-a-kind, essentially, technology development. AP1000, which is the Westinghouse brand, has never been built before. The EPR, which is the reactor in Europe, has never been built before. Both are suffering years of delay and years of escalating costs. However, the expectation is that once the lessons have been learned, one would be able to say next ones will be cheaper and hopefully quicker. Well, let me summarize. I know I can go on and on because I have many different findings and that will be found in the report. But the bottom line is essentially is for the decision makers, there's got to be some policy changes that have to take place to enable new nuclear power construction. It's no longer adequate to say, well, let's let the market decide, because the market's already been distorted by subsidies for solar and wind, low natural gas prices, and the technology choice is going to have to be made on many, many different factors besides costs. If you believe in global climate change, you're going to have to take nuclear seriously, because it is one of the only large-scale generating sources that can address the major problems that are global. Okay, with that, I will close.
Thank you very much, Andy. Tim?
Great. So I, like Andy, when I started working on this paper, I thought, well, clearly there's a role for policy in reviving, expanding, enhancing U.S. nuclear leadership. When I started, when you see the paper, there's a historical perspective that I kind of go back and look at, where we were from the first atomic test through the Atoms for Peace, through the Atomic Energy Commission, through the Joint Commission on Atomic Energy in Congress. And then when I go back and I look at all of that, it's clear that we were headed down a road at that time, we, the United States, of really expanding our footprint, if you will, nuclear reactor, nuclear power. Of course, nuclear weapons space goes without saying at that point. What I came across was a series of actions that, when taken uniquely or separately, kind of look like they're not going to make any difference in the U.S. leadership stance. But whenever you kind of put them all together, it really has been kind of a negative impact on U.S. leadership when taken broadly. Just the first, our first step really to global leadership was the Atoms for Peace in 1954 that President Eisenhower, his speech. Great idea, wonderful. We shipped a lot of HEU around the world in that time frame. By some measures, up to 6 metric tons. And then as we saw it evolve, and now, oh my God, proliferation's a big deal. As Richard was quick to point out, we've been busy repatriating that HEU since we wanted to expand the global energy and the nuclear energy. I talked about the AEC. And then in more recent years, of course, we've had EPAC of 2005, which many of us were in the business then, and we all thought, well, this is the nuclear renaissance. And then, it's a whole nother paper to discuss what happened to the nuclear renaissance. But it was a good step by my friend Pete Domenici to try, the principal architect of EPAC, to try to move nuclear power forward. The nuclear loan guarantees came from EPAC. But then when I go back and then I look at decisions that have been made, in my opinion, one of the decisions that has hurt our global leadership in kind of taking away our standing in the world was the 1977 decision by President Carter to abandon reprocessing in the United States. Now, subsequently was overturned, reversed is a better word to use, by President Reagan. In the Clinton administration, the Reagan position was more reinforced. It wasn't a turn back to what President Carter had done. But all of these things put us, the United States, kind of on the outside looking in as the countries that we thought would not pursue reprocessing or recycling plutonium into MOX fuel. In fact, went ahead and recycled plutonium out of their reactors into MOX. There were a couple of other key decisions, I think. For those of you that are familiar with the FFTF, the Fast Flux Test Facility out at Hanford, it was a key decision to shut that down, Clinton administration. Followed not too far by EBR-2 in Idaho. And that essentially put us out of the fast neutron business in the United States. It didn't essentially, we were out of the fast neutron business in the United States. The big impact there is now we've got companies that are looking for fast neutrons in the United States, and we don't have any, so they're going overseas, either to Russia or China. So I looked at Oh, wait, I gotta mention Yucca Mountain. So Yucca Mountain was another, a big detriment to I think, to our posture. I'm not one of those that believe that nuclear power is going to live or die on the back of Yucca Mountain. You know, natural gas and other things, renewables, production tax credits for the renewables, are all doing fine and hurting our nuclear industry in the U.S. But certainly it didn't help. We were leading the pack. We had our application at the end of the Bush administration in 2008 into the NRC. Clearly, we were leading the world in finding a solution for our own global fuel, our own inventory of spent nuclear fuel. And that's kind of, well, you know, the Obama administration put an end to that. I'm encouraged by the blueprint that President Trump put out that shows $120 million in FY18 for Yucca Mountain licensing activities. We'll see where it goes. Nevada has not abandoned their opposition by any way, shape, or form. So let me jump quickly to a few things that I think that I wanted to talk about that I believe would help revive our leadership potential and globally. Number one of those is a presidential policy statement from the new administration saying we will lead in nuclear energy in the world. That is all of the leadership, to my mind, is built on the back of world-class R&D facilities. That includes a test reactor, a fast neutron spectrum reactor, some additional facilities that we don't have. And I had on my list, and you'll see it in the paper, to start pursuing Yucca Mountain again. So they beat me to the punch on that one. I do talk in the paper about MOX, and I talk about MOX only from the concept of whether you like the idea of taking weapons-grade plutonium and putting it into MOX fuel or you don't. That facility was going to be a state-of-the-art facility globally, and I think those are the kind of things that we need to exhibit our leadership and continue. One of the things I talk about in the paper that you'll see is loosening the view on reprocessing globally. There are several separation schemes out there that do not separate plutonium as a sole constituent. Areva has COEX, which separates the uranium and precipitates, not just separates, precipitates together the plutonium and the uranium, so you never have separated plutonium on its own. Those are the kind of things I think that we could support, realizing that enrichment is probably the quickest way to a nuclear weapon these days. Another big one is just an indigenous enrichment capability. We are woefully inadequate in the ability to enrich material that we would use for our reactors for just production of tritium, production of HEU, for whatever reason. All the enrichment capacity that's in the United States is foreign owned, or the technology is foreign origin. Running out of time. I think I'll stop right there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Nicola?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I will briefly address the final paper of the triptych that Richard and I wrote on the geopolitics of nuclear power and technology. The decision to identify the paper as an evaluation of the geopolitics of nuclear power and technology was a conscious one. This in consideration of the fact that the development and deployment of nuclear power and technology has been linked to geopolitical factors to a degree that is really unprecedented in the history of science and technology. But let me start by briefly framing the issue and summarizing the global energy scenario. Carbon-rich fuels, coal, petroleum, and natural gas offer many advantages over other energy sources. They have a much superior energy density, a wide range of uses, and they're relatively easy to transport and store. Often, they can also be inexpensive, particularly when you have an existing infrastructure that allows a supply to meet demand. And for this reason, fossil fuels are expected to remain a significant part of the world's energy mix for several decades to come. Indeed, the Energy Information Administration predicts that fossil fuel will still account for about 78% of total world energy consumption by 2040. At the same time, fossil fuels present some obvious downsides, particularly related to the environment and climate change. This, taken in combination with a persistent desire on the part of countries around the world for more stable, more secure energy supplies, has sparked interest in alternative energy forms. Energy efficiency will play and can play an important role in reducing the predominance of fossil fuels, but advances in efficiency alone probably will not be enough for making up what we would lose if fossil fuels were to be phased out. This is particularly true in some sectors like petrochemicals and transportation, which will most likely be heavily dependent on fossil fuel for the near future. Renewable energy, such as solar and wind power, hold future potential, but given the requirements of modern economy, challenges of intermittency, and renewable sources' relative inferior energy density, as we said, other energy sources might also be needed. And this is where nuclear comes into the picture. Nuclear power, with its high energy density and low carbon footprint, is an energy source with which the international community has had decades of experience. However, the challenges that come along with the technology have kept it from becoming a more dominant factor in the global energy mix. Geopolitical issues lie at the center of many of these challenges. As Andy just discussed, from a technological point of view, the factors influencing nuclear development and adoption are economic, safety, fuel cycle waste, licensing experience base, and non-proliferation. At the same time, it is clear how simple economics or even political analysis cannot explain how nuclear has evolved and prospered in some areas of the world and faltered in others. Many variables, security, politics, economics, demographics, perception of safety, also a desire for prestige, have all interacted one time or another in most countries involved to create the current situation. These variables highlight the opportunities and challenges that exist with regard to the development and deploy of nuclear power and technology worldwide. In our paper, we have identified 3 key questions that policymakers and industry need to address before nuclear power can truly play a constructive role in addressing the energy needs of the 21st century, both in the developed world and in emerging markets. What are these questions? First of all, how can policymakers and the public better assess and balance the costs and benefits associated with nuclear power, but in general with all energy sources? Second, how can costs in research and development and government funding be managed to ensure private sector investment and participation? And this goes in a way back to Westinghouse. Finally, if nuclear is to be part of the global energy mix, what is the responsibility of the United States, Western Europe, and Eastern Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea to be part of it? And what role could the private sector in this country play to ensure that the highest standards for safety, non-proliferation, and security remain at the forefront for all stakeholders? These are not easy questions, both from a technological and policy point of view. What appears very clear, though, is that policymakers around the world need to decide whether nuclear power has to be part of the global energy mix, and if so, how to better support these efforts. We believe the following elements are of paramount importance and need to be part of the solution. First, a combined approach to demystify the science around nuclear power, and to ensure that local communities and the public at large have an appropriate appreciation of the role that nuclear energy can play and plays. Second, the need for government support of nuclear research and development, and goes to the point that was just mentioned, both through investment vehicles and private-public partnership. This should also include incentivizing the safe, economic, and reliable operation of the current fleet of nuclear reactors, identifying and implementing mechanisms to streamline the R&D process. As Andy mentioned, the development pipeline has become saturated with designs that have no chance of entering production and sap millions of dollars in resources that might be better applied in bringing to the market only the most promising reactors, and that's what we call the technology down selection. In other words, if nuclear power needs to play a role in energy security, climate and air pollution, financing and public concerns are indeed key issues that need to be addressed. And at the same time, appropriate market structure recognizing cross-cutting benefits and costs will be critical in order to recognize the full value of all generating options. Finally, we see the need for a renewed global partnership for managing the risk of proliferation, combining political and technical factors. This should include not only cooperation among governments to reduce the proliferation risk of nuclear reactors, but also improve export controls on a global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. And over to Trish to anchor our little relay here.
All right. Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event. I thought I would start off by just briefly giving you an overview of my own background in this area to frame the comments that I'm going to make. My master's and PhD research actually examined options for nuclear waste disposal, both what was termed high-level waste and low-level waste at the time. And the focus was geological disposal for waste that was generated via commercial activities. More recently, I have become engaged in studies that are examining cleanup of legacy wastes that are actually associated with nuclear weapons production. I served on the Nuclear and Radiation Studies Board of the National Academies for 6 years, and I've been engaged in multiple National Academy studies that have looked at legacy waste disposal. And finally, I've also been engaged in an initial study to examine whether or not there are increased cancer risks associated with living in proximity to a nuclear power plant. This initial study was to take part in the US, and it actually didn't proceed beyond stage 1 and stage 2 investigation. A couple of points that I would like to raise. One point that was made in the papers that are part of this panel discussion was that if the United States is to play a positive and constructive role in the worldwide expansion of nuclear power, it must revive and expand its position as a global nuclear leader. And I agree wholeheartedly with this statement. However, from my perspective, I think there are multiple hurdles in the way of the US reviving and expanding its position as a global nuclear leader. And I don't think these hurdles are necessarily rooted in technical challenges. The first hurdle I see is that in the US, we lack disposal pathways for many of the wastes that are generated through the production of nuclear power. We've had a discussion about the Yucca Mountain repository not going forward under the Obama administration. I guess we have yet to see whether that's going to be revived under the current administration. But I think until we have a national repository or other disposal pathways for some of the wastes that are generated, it is going to be very difficult to move forward. And I don't think that this is technical. I think the fact that we don't have a repository has to do with a conversation that has not been very productive between the stakeholders in this field, which involve the public, and many of those involved in nuclear power production. The second thing that I think is a hurdle, which actually relates to the first that we need to overcome, which is a policy hurdle, is the waste classification system that we have in this country is actually very complicated. For those of you that are aware, it's based on waste origin and not necessarily on the threat that the waste might pose to human health and the environment. And that actually complicates the disposal pathways that are available for many of this waste, and it makes some of them very expensive when they need not necessarily be. So I think a re-examining of the policy for the waste disposal is something else that is necessary if we are to commit to a nuclear future in this country. Third, I think we do need to start thinking, when we think of waste disposal, of risk-based disposal options versus the current system that we have in place. Some of these nuclear wastes are going to remain a threat for tens, hundreds of thousands of years. And the current way that we go about designing disposal options for them requires us to guarantee safety for a member of the public that might inadvertently intrude on the waste repository 10,000 years from now. Personally think that that type of standard is nonsensical. I don't think we know 10 to 100,000 years from now whether or not those wastes still pose a threat. We may have cure for cancer, for example. So I think we need to think of a risk-based adaptive approach. And that's a huge policy challenge. And finally, and I think this is most important, the US has not done a good job in having a robust conversation with the public about nuclear power, its benefits, the risks it poses, and in particular what we do with the wastes. In the many years that I've been working in this area, all of my interactions with the public have led me to believe that they have serious concerns about whether or not, for example, living next to a nuclear power station is going to increase their risk of getting cancer. They have serious concerns about having a waste repository system in their backyard. They have serious concerns about waste being moved around the country on our transportation system. I think our attitude so far has been to educate the public. I think that attitude has to change because it indicates that we think that the public is uneducated. The public is very educated. And I think we need to start a two-way conversation on this. I don't think it's just about us as scientists and engineers and policymakers telling the public that we know this is a good option. I think we have to listen to their concerns and take them into account. And I'm going to conclude my remarks by saying I think the Canadians are a population that we can learn from in this particular area. The way that they have approached this has been a two-way public conversation. They, I think, are close to getting a national repository cited. They're going through various environmental steps right now to move that forward. And that happened because they literally asked the public if they would want a repository cited in their area. They got various communities to volunteer, and I think they worked out a participatory system that ended up with a very good outcome for the country, and we have yet to do that in the US.
Thank you very much for that. That was a great way to end our panel opening remarks, I think, because it stitched together a number of the issues that the panelists spoke to, particularly about the issues in public attitude with regard to nuclear, which in my experience has likewise been a very controversial and complicated sort of discussion to have. But part of this all comes back to questions of fundamental economics and whether or not nuclear energy and nuclear power is a wise investment. And I think members of the panel have spoke to the questions of climate change and the degree to which it's a long-term investment, one that pays off. But then we have news like Westinghouse, and I think all of us have spoken to it to some degree. But I'm going to take the opportunity to just pin down each of our panelists a little bit about what they think about the Westinghouse bankruptcy filing. Are they concerned about what it means for nuclear in the United States? Do they think this is an opportunity? Just get your fresh, unscripted thoughts about what we should take from Westinghouse, and we'll go back down the line. So, Andy, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I unfortunately had a period of time where I could think about this question.
Yeah.
Yesterday I was interviewed by a Japanese newspaper about what they thought the bankruptcy meant to the U.S. And I said, Well, you know, everybody knew that the plant was behind schedule. Everybody knew that the costs were running over. So, and everybody knew that there were suits between the parties that claiming, you know, certain damages and certain obligations to pay. So, all right, so what's the news? Is the news a big dramatic announcement that the nuclear industry is collapsing in the United States because one company files for bankruptcy? It's not a disaster. It's a financial path to settlement of the various disputes that are underway. Are the plants going to be continued in terms of construction? My opinion is yes, because every day they reach milestones of that project, the utilities pay Westinghouse Toshiba money. The last thing Westinghouse Toshiba wants to have happen is that the money stops flowing, which makes a bad situation, obviously overruns and schedule delays, even worse. So I think it has a psychological impact for sure. The question then becomes, well, how does it affect future investment in nuclear power? I answer that question by saying it depends on how and who is found at fault, and whether or not any lessons have been learned in this process. People make certain accusations about Westinghouse being mismanaged. People make certain accusations about the regulatory system being too difficult and rigid and constantly changing. Once all that is aired out, the hopeful lesson is we will not do this again. Recall, the last time we built a nuclear power plant was over 30 years ago. The infrastructure wasn't there. The supply chain wasn't there. All these issues had to be recreated. And this is unfortunately the price that Westinghouse is paying. Westinghouse is not alone. Our friends in France, in the Flamanville plant, in Ocolito, they're even worse off than the Westinghouse situation. Their plant's over 10 years behind schedule. Westinghouse maybe 3 or 4. The EPRs in China are 3 or 4 years behind schedule. So the same problems that have happened to Westinghouse are happening to Areva, EDF, or that consortium. So it's lessons learned from the beginning of restarting an enterprise. So it'll shake out, and as the investors look at the shakeout situation, they will have to make their own decision whether this is a prudent investment. My guess is this will help small modular reactors.
So I agree with Andy on most, if not all. And I would caution you that a first-of-a-kind plant in the United States is not the same as one in China. You know, the idea that, as Andy pointed out, we haven't built a new plant. You know, TVA has brought some old reactors up and started them, but we haven't built a new plant from scratch in decades. And the supply chain Andy highlighted was absent in the United States. We had to go offshore for a lot of that stuff. Some of it had to be reestablished. Just simply the welding qualifications to do nuclear welding, you know, there aren't a whole lot of those people around. There's more of them now than there were, you know, 5 years ago. And what's important to me from this, I'm with Andy. I think it'll all shake out. They'll continue to build the units. Part of the reason is they've got a lot of money now in those units. To abandon them now would be tough to do, I think, from a business perspective. I also don't think they'll try to slow down or delay, because with big, large projects like that, when you slow down and delay, you just increase the cost further. You slip it out. You've got hotel costs, which are just costs that you're going to have to maintain whether you finish tomorrow or you finish in a week. You've got the standing army that you're going to need. I believe they ought to be put to work. And one of the takeaways from this, and I highlighted it in the Westinghouse press release, you know, their CEO said they're going to plan to resolve the financial challenges while protecting our core businesses. So they're not planning to get out of the nuclear business. You know, their fuel fabrication, their maintenance, their reload, all that stuff they're trying to protect, and frankly, from a business perspective, you know, setting off your problem child to one side and addressing that separately from all the rest of your core business that's presumably making money, I think was a smart and prudent action.
Thank you. Nicola?
So I actually was interviewed by the same newspaper. I well, I agree with most of what has been said. The thing that I would add is the fact, as Tim and Andy mentioned, we have lost the nuclear supply chain. And really having an active U.S. nuclear power industry is fundamental to provide the technological and practice needed to have technological leadership, but also to assure safe and secure operation of the nuclear plants and of the fuel cycle. And I strongly hope that this will not impact this. I probably just would want to wait and see a little how it pans out.
Fair enough, Trish?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Andy that I think it's more of a psychological impact than anything else, and how that psychological impact rolls out when we think about public perception and trying to cite nuclear power points, I think is unclear. But I think we're a long way off doing that, so I'm sure the memory of this might have faded into the background before we get to that particular point.
All right, thank you very much to all of you. Again, for those who are watching online and listening to the podcast, my name is Richard Nephew, and I am here with Andy Caddick, Tim Frazier, Nicola de Blasio, and Patricia Culligan. I'm going to take the privilege of asking a few more questions, and then we'll turn things over to the audience, both here as well as online. Just as a reminder, if anyone is watching online and has any questions, you can tweet them at Richard M. Nephew, and I'll receive them and be able to read them out here. I'm going to go back to Trish for my first question. I was struck by your points about the need to think about public education in a different sort of way, in part because the question I'd written down uses the term public education, which probably speaks to an inherent problem in folks who have been thinking about this for a long time, basic thinking about outreach. The other problem, though, is even the numbers that you cited about waste and how long it lives, 10,000 years, hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, when you say that to a person on the street, I think the immediate action and reaction is, wow, that's a long time. Do we really know? You say that we don't know what advances we'll have in science to deal with the side effects, but do we even know what the world will look like then? Isn't it dangerous fundamentally, even to be creating these products that we have to manage? So I guess the question that I would ask is, you've got a lot of experience in dealing with practical challenges here. You mentioned Canada and how it's addressing this problem. Are there any particular lessons you think the nuclear industry specifically ought to take from this experience and the question about how to work with and talk with the public? Are there ways of addressing this problem of 10,000 years and contextualizing it that make them feel a little bit better? What are your thoughts about specifically what we could put forward?
Well, let me start off with the first question. Are we sure the waste is long-lived? Yes, I think we're sure the waste is long-lived. And do we have a lot of waste that we already need to deal with? Yes. So it's not like we can move backwards in dealing with long-lived wastes. The approach that I think we could take with this, which in fact we're going to be taking as we start to see the impacts of climate change, is going to be an adaptive approach. Basically to think about adaptation to strategies for dealing with the waste. Not to promise the public or ourselves that we can build a repository that 10,000 years from now is still going to function as we have designed it today. So I think as a society, if we could think more and more along the lines of having to adapt to change, and it's not just in the context of dealing with long-lived wastes, but other changes that are coming our way, I think we'll be on a pathway to solving and dealing with many of the complicated problems that we currently face. So that was the answer to the first question, and I've forgotten your second question.
Well, it was just a question of the specific lessons that the nuclear industry can learn about how to...
It's quite interesting. So when I was working with the committee that was initiating a study into whether or not there were cancer risks associated with living in proximity to a nuclear power plant in the U.S., we were engaged with multiple site visits. to facilities, to places where we were gathering public opinion. And I would say that right now the nuclear power industry in the US is very heterogeneous in the way that it interacts with the public. And I think the nuclear power industry itself could learn lessons from the different ways and approaches that they've taken to dealing with, for example, the residents that live near their facilities. Some facilities welcome public visits. They engage the public in committees where they discuss mutual issues, mutual concerns, and some are closed-door facilities. So I think this conversation, if we're just focusing on the nuclear power industry, should start between the nuclear power industry, the facilities themselves, and their local public. Just one final point to make, and I think it's an obvious point. When we say the public, there's not one public, okay? There's a whole range of heterogeneous opinions that need to be taken into account. And what I see is currently lacking in this field is a robust engagement with those of us that have engineering and technology training with social scientists. I think we really do need to stop seeing this just as a technical issue and as an issue, as I said, of public education. I think we need to take much more seriously the lessons that our colleagues in social science have learned when it comes to two-way productive discussions between different stakeholders.
That's very interesting, especially it reminds me of when I worked at the Department of Energy and I took a trip to Idaho National Laboratory and I visited a reactor, looked down in the spent fuel pond and I saw the pretty blue radiation and immediately left and called my wife, and we hadn't had kids at the time, and her reaction was not as intrigued as mine was, but shows a little bit of the differences in how people will think about these things until they've actually seen it. Tim, this takes me to a fundamental question about what is Washington going to do? We know that there's a need for a change in the conversation, a change in how it's approached. Washington's not terribly good at that, having served there myself. And we've got a new administration in place that has already had a bit of a contested relationship with Congress, particularly when we think about the potential federal exposure to nuclear industry and nuclear problems. I mean, even the Westinghouse example and filing points to some of the concerns that people might have because a couple of those reactors are covered under the loan guarantee program. So can you talk a little bit about what you think, you've told us what you think we ought to do. What do you think will actually happen, and what are some challenges that are coming ahead?
So to my mind, let me say one thing about Trish first.
Please.
Something she mentioned. Those of us that are in the business, we always tend to think that if we can just make the public understand, they'll get it, right? And if I can make them understand, they'll be absolutely as comfortable with nuclear power as I am. And that is not the case. I mean, they all come with their own set of internal priority systems and risks analysis and such. But at the Department of Energy, when I was still there, and during the Blue Ribbon Commission, we had a hell of a time with folks that were just, well, you just need to go out and explain it and make sure that they understand it. And when they understand it, it'll all be fine. And that's not the way these many heterogeneous publics that Trish talked about are out there. Anyway, to the question at hand. So the first big step, I think that the administration has taken is in fact they've included money for Yucca Mountain in their blueprint. I expect the Department of Energy to hopefully be getting ready for some money to show up. Whether they get the whole 120 or not, who knows? But certainly I expect there will be some funding. And as the department moves forward, we'll see where that goes. What I didn't see was any money in the blueprint for NRC to do licensing. So if you don't know how that works, typically licensees pay for services, but in Yucca Mountain has always been, NRC was separately appropriated funds to do the licensing activities for Yucca Mountain. So I didn't see it in there. Doesn't mean it's not there somewhere. I mean, everybody's waiting for the next level down to come out so we can really look at it. So I think there's going to be support for nuclear. I hope there's going to be support for nuclear. My contacts, I mean, the people that I used to work with and know well in the Office of Nuclear Energy at DOE are optimistic. There was one line in, and I wish I could find it quickly. There was a line in the budget blueprint for EERE and, which is energy efficiency or renewable energy, and the Office of Nuclear Energy and a couple others to focus in more on what the federal, focus in on supporting a more federal role. So, you know, I sat around with a couple guys down at Savannah River yesterday, and we tried to figure out what that could possibly mean. Does that mean that they're going to go back to focusing on the R&D activities that are just too much for commercial entities or colleges or universities or whatever to really move something forward where it takes a real government source of funds to get it done? Is that what that means? Or does that mean, well, you're going to pull back and do basic research? So it's hard to know at this point. I think a real indication will be who Secretary Perry and the administration select to be the head of the Office of Nuclear Energy. I think that's going to be key. I'm waiting to see if it's going to be, you know, someone who is a forward thinker on nuclear power and nuclear energy. But the research side, you know, science took a pretty good hit. Office of Science, which is a basic science at the department, you know, they took a fairly good hit. I think it's almost $900 million. I mean, it was a chunk. So there's going to be some impact there, but then, you know, that's kind of more basic science. It seems to me that they're going to move farther down the applied science side of things, applied engineering. I still think it's good for I think it's good for the nuclear side of the world. You know, they're not great guns about climate change, but they're certainly, you know, great guns about good jobs and U.S. leadership. I mean, we had, I'll quote this because I didn't say it, but there was a guy at one of the meetings I was at in Washington, instead of make America great again, it's make nuclear great again. So there's this kind of rejuvenation that, well, look, the Obama administration wasn't terribly bad to nuclear. I don't want to put that impression out there. My impression of that was they were ambivalent to it. But clearly there's this opportunity that people feel like in Washington at least, that this is a chance to put nuclear more out on the forefront. So hopefully, as soon as we see what the next level down of the budget is, that's what we'll tell.
Andy?
Yeah, I'd like to address the waste question as well. I served 8 years on the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technology Review Board, so I got up close and personal with a lot of the stakeholders. The most vocal ones who attended our meetings were the opponents, obviously, but there were also supporters in the audience, and we had all of our all the meetings were public, and most of them were in the Nevada area, Las Vegas or near the site. The whole issue of Yucca Mountain is I think a political one, and it was unfortunate. And now that Senator Reid from Nevada is no longer the Senate Majority Leader, maybe they'll get some money to continue continue NRC's review. We did review the draft NRC application findings, which basically said for Yucca Mountain that it was acceptable. There were some issues that needed to be addressed. At that point, Senator Reid decided that was too close for comfort relative to showing that the facility could be safely built and operated, and that's where the funding got pulled. My expectation with Governor Perry, or now Secretary of Energy Perry's visit to Yucca Mountain, I think it was last week, is that they will use the money to complete the safety review. And the final steps of the safety review are really the legal dotting of the i's and crossing of the t's, because the technical part was completed. My guess is, and it's a guess, that President Trump will use that money and then determine whether it can be safely operated before he puts his neck out and says, I want to go this way. The law of the land is still Yucca Mountain. That's where the repository has to be. Until that law is changed, and I see no effort on anybody's part to change that basic law, which was passed in 1987, and Maureen, you could probably confirm that. So that's the way it's going. Now Trish mentioned we need to apply risk-informed techniques. The licensing basis for Yucca Mountain is risk-based. In other words, they have to calculate the risk to the public from all sources on a probabilistic basis for 10,000, and in fact out to 1 million years. And if you look at the studies, they have all these horsetail things that project risk given certain scenarios, whether it be volcanic eruptions, whether it be seismic events, whether it be flooding, who knows what. They have calculated all those things. I personally don't think they're necessarily useful calculations, because it is quite, put the model, run the model, put the good data in, put the bad data in, you come out with some numbers. The fact of the matter is, most people can predict with some certainty 3,000 years. The pyramids are 3,000 years old, for God's sakes. You ought to be able to figure out, with today's technology, we can do that at least, geologically. So, as she said, adaptive is fine, but the standard, unfortunately, established by the regulation is 10,000 years. And it doesn't say absolute safety, it says that it's acceptable. It's an acceptable risk. So we've got all the probabilistic risk, we've got all this risk-informed stuff. Tim's point exactly right. There are people who just will not accept nuclear power, will not accept any risk from nuclear power or anything else. Well, depends on what that other thing is. Driving a car is okay, nuclear power is not. So you have to deal with that. You can have all the dialogue you want. You'll not change any opinion. But that's our experience. Let me just, one final question about health effects around nuclear power plants. This is not a new issue. Health effects around nuclear power plants have been studied for like 30 years. Every few years there's another study showing essentially no effect. And I guess they're about to start another one, and okay, we'll show the same thing. And it's okay, I think, but the perception is, and it continues to be promulgated by people who say nuclear is unsafe, therefore there's a safety risk, any amount of radiation causes cancer. But these people willingly go and get chest x-rays, medical x-rays, 1 million diagnostic treatments in a hospital with radiation, that's okay. Why is it okay for them? Because they see some benefit to it. They used to call magnetic resonance imaging, we've all had it, used to be called nuclear magnetic resonance imaging. Because of the psychosis here, they've dropped the N. Now it's MRIs instead of NMRIs, which was the traditional term. So we have to deal with that as the industry. I hate to use the word education, but I think education is important in this area. And it's not pontification, it's education and understanding. So people, at least if they want to make a decision, informed or uninformed about the real facts, they'll at least have the opportunity to learn about what they may be, and you can reject them if you wish. So that's my 2 cents on the question. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And in fact, it goes to a question that I wanted to ask you as well about NRC regulations in general. And I think in your paper, you talk a little bit about the way in which the NRC is presently conducting its regulatory reviews on the basis of what reactors we've had. But how is that system needing to change now on the basis of all the different types of reactors that we've got that are potentially in play?
Right. The NRC system is based on what are called prescriptive regulations. And they assume water is the coolant. So they have certain rules and requirements for loss of coolant accidents. They have certain requirements for loss of certain systems. And in the new reactors, in these innovative reactors, non-water cooled, they have different technologies that call for different safety answers. What I've been advocating, and most people are now looking at, and I think the new chairman is also looking at it, it's called a risk-informed safety licensing process. So instead of having, well, you need to comply with regulation 10.5, which is applied to a water system, you'll have to say, well, it doesn't apply to me because I don't have water. You, as a developer, make the safety case using risk, technology neutral, and from that process, you need to demonstrate to the regulator that this plant is in fact safe. You can then take advantage of all the innovation that you're not now credited for in designing a reactor, which sounds rather strange, but that's the way it is. You'll spend most of the time in your application showing why this regulation doesn't apply. And to a general member of the public, oh, you're not complying to that regulation, you're not complying with that regulation or that regulation, that means the plant's not safe. That's the bad standard that's currently being used. And NRC is slowly, grudgingly moving into risk-informed, technology neutral, which will allow all these new innovative reactors to come to fruition. China is developing a reactor, and I'm not promoting it particularly, but I was there. It's called a high-temperature pebble bed reactor. This reactor will not melt down. Will not melt down. We saw a test of their safety system, which really wasn't a safety system. Physically, the reactor cannot overheat. You can shut off all the cooling. You can not shut the reactor down using the control rods. And then you can isolate the system from any kind of heat removal except natural to the environment from the reactor concrete. The reactor does what it does, the reactor is slowly shut itself down. And after a while, it comes up a little bit, it heats up a little bit, and it shuts itself down. This is the kind of technology that we need to help the public become more convinced that these reactors are truly safe. A reactor that cannot melt down. And so there's a company in the United States that's also developing that technology. The next generation nuclear plant project that was canceled because of lack of support, again, had that same technology. So there are technology solutions that the regulatory system is not capable of coping with.
No, thank you for that, and especially it highlights some of the new and emerging designs that exist. One of the things that Nicola and I talk about in our paper is the fact that R&D is a huge part of the costs that companies have to make in order to field new designs and new reactors. And combined with the regulatory process, combined with the uncertainties around the industry, this makes it very difficult to make these kinds of investments. So Nicola, do you want to talk a little bit about what should be the role of government in helping companies address issues of R&D and the plethora of options that now exist in terms of 102 pages, I think, of reactor designs that Andy surveyed for us. Yeah.
So let me start by that, because I got the point from Andy at the beginning. I need to take the blame for how long that paper became.
Okay. You're forgiven.
Thank you. So to the point that Andy, that we were joking just now with Andy, we started this by really trying to compare new reactor designs. We were not expecting the sheer amount of reactors that are out there. So the challenge then became when we started looking in more details about the 5 parameters, how do we compare them? So considering that it's actually 200 pages, and trust me, even for those in the sector, 200 pages of reactor design is a long read. We then decided to try to compare them by doing a table, in which you'll see in the report a comparison table where we basically put all the 5 factors and try to compare all these designs. The challenge became that for a lot of these designs, you actually don't find the numbers. So we reverted to a more qualitative analysis, whether compared to the existing light waters reactors, if with respect to the 5 parameters, these designs were better or worse, and in what sense. It became also clear that if you want to optimize for some parameters, you actually damage other parameters for these reactors. But going to the point that Richard was making, if you have 45 countries and more than 50 designs, and the goal is, going back to what Andy mentioned at the beginning, the goal is to leverage economies of mass production instead of economies of scale. You want to make them smaller because they're going to be cheaper. But if you have 50 designs, and for some of these, you don't even have the basic economics or parameters defined, how are you going to bring them to the market in a way that you do leverage economy of scale, of mass production? You cannot. So how are you going to license 50 different designs? Are you going to be able to license them? Does it make sense from an economic point of view? If you think about it, if you have to develop 50 designs, how much money do you need? Think about the cost for one. So what's the role of a government, an international community in this? And we think that a technology down select that actually helps to focus on the most promising design is the only way to approach this. There is no way that 50 different designs will come to the market. And in a way where you can actually leverage economies of mass production instead of economy of scales. Otherwise, we're going to have the same problems that we're having now, instead for a few designs for 50 designs.
No, I very much agree. I think we've now reached the moment where I've got to stop our conversation up here and take some questions from the audience, both here in the room as well as for folks who are watching online. In fact, I've already got a couple of questions from the online audience. For those of you who are here in person and have a question to ask, please just line up here at the microphone, and then we'll be happy to take them in the order that we've got. For those watching online, again, you can use the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @Columbia U Energy, or my own one, @Richard M. Nephew, to ask a question. Ma'am, please go ahead.
Oh, good morning. Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Maureen Coates. Senator Domenici was my boss, not my friend, many years ago, and I also served on the Senate Energy Committee and worked at the Nuclear Energy Institute. When Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, he said the means of production included land, labor, and capital. And we now know that land and water and air are all three independent and co-equal independent variables which constitute the carrying capacity for any economic activity, right? You have to marry technology with carrying capacity in order to produce a good or a service. So what I'd like to know is, we talk all the time about capital in terms of financial, but I don't hear any of you talking about the fact that the non-use of air, land, and water in the means of production when we come out with electricity and kilowattage is actually creating wealth. That natural capital efficiency and non-use by nuclear is its own form of wealth, number one. And number two, the fact that nuclear has been so natural capital efficient for 50 years has in fact left air shed capacity and water capacity and land capacity available at a much lower price to its highest competitors. And what are you all talking about in terms of those economics? In other words, the pre-transactional economics of natural capital efficiency as a massive, number one, wealth value that nuclear has never accrued, which would more than balance whatever financial capital is required. And secondly, the fact that it has created a very dangerous subsidy that has allowed some of the most dangerous technologies, fossil technologies, to exist long past their useful life. Because as we know, unlike money and labor, we can't make any more planets.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Anyone want to take that one on?
Maureen, that's very philosophical and very high level for me. I know, I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. You know, you're absolutely right. There is little credit given to nuclear for its energy intensity and its minimal use of all these other resources. Capital, minimal use of this capital. And the classic example basically is wind. Although wind is not very land intrusive, it takes a lot of windmills to replace 1,000 nuclear power plant. I was in Finland at the Olkiluoto plant, and I saw one isolated windmill standing there, and I said, well, how big is that one? She says, 1 megawatt. So are you telling me Finland's going to put 1,000 of these around your country or in the ocean to replace this one plant? She said, yes. I said, well, there's some slight error in your calculation, because the capacity of these windmills on average is about only 30%. So you need about 3 times those. So you're talking 3,000 of these windmills to replace this one nuclear power plant on average. She said, oh my goodness. End of story.
So I think that in a way that's what we mean when we say that we have to evaluate all the costs and benefits of all energy sources. And if you don't do that, you really are not able to compare them in a fair way.
And this actually will take me to a question that we've got online. It segues naturally, which is for the panel to talk a little bit about the future of zero-emission power credits for nuclear in the United States. And in fact, I mean, I think all of our papers to some extent touch on this at various different points in time. I don't know if anyone would like to speak to that.
I think the future depends on policy and politics. And if you're serious about global climate change, you must give credit, fair credit, to nuclear, equivalent to that which you give to solar and wind, or other non-emitting sources. And right now, that's not happening. A couple of states are giving those credits, but generally speaking, it is not. The EPA Clean Power Act, quote unquote, it's not my word, it's theirs, was a disaster from that perspective. They didn't credit any single existing nuclear plant for its clean air emissions. Only future nuclear plants were credited. There you go. Is EPA anti-nuclear? Is EPA anti-clean air? Sure sounds like it. End of statement.
Tim, did you want to touch on this?
Just because there are a lot of marginal operating, and by marginal I mean financially marginal operating nuclear plants in the United States. I mean, we've seen way too many, in my opinion, shut down in the last 3 or 4 years. And at least many will tell you that part of the problem is the production tax credits that go along with the wind and solar, but it's really the wind that seems to drive them crazy. You know, when you can bid negative into a market, and I'm going to make these numbers up because I don't know what the right ones are, you'll sell it for -5 cents a kilowatt, and you're actually getting reimbursed for the production at 15 cents a kilowatt. Well, you still make 10 cents a kilowatt, and the nuclear plants just can't. Number one, they don't load follow, so you can't, you know, you don't ramp them up and ramp them down. So they're a steady state, stable supply. Another thing that so that's one of the things I highlight in my paper.
And you're paying to produce power to
That's
the
right.
grid.
Yeah.
That's missing. They have to pay money to the grid to continue to operate because it's a negative price.
So
That's bizarre.
So, yeah, but they make it back in what the tax credit is. Yeah, not nuclear.
Sorry.
Sorry.
You'll come back to it. We'll pull it back out of you.
I'll get you.
Sir, go ahead.
Yeah, Ben Dennison with LaRouche Political Action Committee. There's some reference, obviously, to the concerns about radiation. And there was reference that there's been studies showing that the health effects near plants is very minuscule. I think it was 2005, the UN did a report on Chernobyl showing that the deaths was in the tens, I believe, and those were mostly people directly exposed in the cleanup, which contradicted many reports of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and people go wild with this stuff. My understanding is a lot of these estimates of higher death rates, higher concern come to this so-called linear no threshold model, where they extrapolate down to very, very, very low doses, adverse health effects seen in higher doses. So I guess I have a two-part question. One is, I'm curious if the panel has any personal views on reassessing that, the use of that model as the basis for, you know, the level of concern. And two, if there's any broader discussion about reassessing that. It seems like that's a big supposed scientific point presented with scientific authority, but seems to have very questionable basis.
Well, thank you for that. Trish, do you want to touch on that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, 2 points. First, yeah, I think with response to the low dose question, I think scientifically, human low dose response to radiation is still not very well known. So I think there's a robust debate among the scientific community about whether the model that you articulated is indeed the proper model. Whether there are efforts to reconsider that, I'm not in the field of health physics, so I can't really speak to that. With respect to the studies, and I'm not going to talk about Chernobyl, I'm going to talk about the studies about potential cancer risks associated with living next to a nuclear facility. I agree with Andy. Most of the studies that have been done in this area have indicated that exposure to medical radiation is probably more problematic than the exposure that you would get. In fact, the type of exposure that you would get living next to a nuclear facility is not something that is of concern at all. The issue with definitively proving that to convince those living in those facilities that they're not at greater risk is an issue of not really having the statistical power to say one way or another.
Yeah.
I mean, if you throw pennies at a map in the U.S., they will cluster.
Right.
If you look at people that have unfortunately experienced cancer, across the U.S., you'll see clusters next to nuclear facilities, and you'll see clusters that are not next to nuclear facilities. But we don't have the statistical power at this point to definitively say. But I think those of us that do dose reconstruction, which is me, are fairly confident in saying there really isn't additional risk. But your point about the dose response curve is well taken.
Let me address your question about this LNT issue. The American Nuclear Society has been looking at this as well as the Health Physics Society to determine whether or not the LNT should be continued to be used. There's a group called the Beer Committee, but they're stuck on this LNT. The typical linear no threshold theory, linear LNT, is being reconsidered as a threshold number, about 10,000 millirem. Below that dose, there is no statistical evidence that there is any biological effect. Above that, it is demonstrable. There is some effect, increasing with dosage. The issue is, if there is no evidence, is there an effect, is the question. And people are being overly conservative. I think the LNT should be used to compare different kinds of risks, not to make predictions of what the risk is, especially for very low doses. But check the ANS website, American Nuclear Society website. There's probably a lot of information there.
Thank you both. Sir?
Yeah, hi, Jonathan Ratner, just interested community member, trying to educate myself. So I think there's a perception, or as our president might say, some people say that there are some unique risks associated with nuclear power, both actual reactors as well as the whole set of logistics around fuel that are unique as compared with other forms of power generation resulting from exposure or the risk of terrorism, cyber warfare. To what extent, if any, is there truth to that in your minds? And if so, what kinds of steps could be taken incrementally to address those risks?
I think unique is probably an unfortunate way to describe it. I think there are different risks, okay? Coal plant burning has different risks than nuclear plants have. I think driving a car is a different risk. People call voluntary risks and involuntary risks. And the voluntary risks are acceptable to people because they choose to take them. The involuntary risks, like living next to a coal plant, a nuclear plant, a wind machine, solar panel, whatever it is, are allegedly involuntary, and people perceive those differently. When you look at the actual risk levels and compare them as actual risk levels, you'll find that nuclear is very, very low on the risk scale to the general public. If you live closer to a nuclear plant, the risks are, let's just say, slightly higher, only because of the potential of an accident, okay? And the accidents that we've had are Chernobyl, Fukushima, and also 3 Mile Island as being the most dramatic. And on the 3 Mile Island one, the public risk was really not a health, not really a radiation risk. It was a psychological risk. People were terrorized by the perhaps inappropriate reporting of that event. So, yes, and the same thing is true in Japan. If you look at the health effects studies that the Japanese have done post-Fukushima, they'll find that most damaging was the psychological risk associated with that accident versus the essentially the radiation type of risk.
Thank you for that. And in fact, actually, you mentioned the word Japan, which will be my trigger for another question from the internet, coming from us from Twitter. What does the Westinghouse bankruptcy filing portend for U.S. relations with Japan? And is there a potential impact more broadly? I'll give my 2 cents very quickly and then turn to our panel. In my view, I think the immediate risk is pretty low, especially considering the breadth of issues and topics of concern and interests that we've got between the United States and Japan. And that's especially the case because to some extent this is a business issue and it's a business problem that is being remedied. But you know, business issues, especially when they stretch into the billions of dollars, can ensnare governments and create some complications. So I don't think this story is over, but I also don't think we should over dramatize how impactful it might be. But I welcome any other views.
I think Nicola should answer because he's got more closer relationships with Japan than I.
I think that the relationship between the U.S. And Japan is too deep and too strong to be affected by this. And in a way, this is it's more of a, I know that, as we said, there are geopolitical implications, but this is a private company issue, not a U.S.-Japan government issue.
Thank you. Okay, we're approaching our 5-minute mark, so here's what I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask, I've got, I think, 3 people who are standing in line. Could you very quickly give us your question? We're going to take all 3 at once, and then we'll farm them out with one last question that I've got online, and then I think we'll be able to wrap on time at 11. So please, ma'am.
Okay. My name's Susanna Clevey. I'm with the Executive Intelligence Review and also with LaRouche. I have the following question. The Indian Point nuclear plant here in New York is being slated to be shut down. There's 1,000 workers at the plant, and Entergy, the company that's shutting it, is in the process of shutting 5 plants throughout the area, including Vermont Yankee, which is about 3,000 highly skilled workers. You talk about the pipeline, and you mentioned the question of nuclear welding, for instance, skills in these areas. Isn't it a catastrophe to shut these plants and to spread this skilled workforce to the winds? This is a proposal that was made at one of the meetings to replace, or at least to put in place, 4th-generation nuclear plants in these areas with this skilled workforce. And to that regard, I wanted to ask, and I'll be very brief,
very quickly, please.
of reprocessing in these new plants. Why worry about yucca and so forth when we can reprocess in the next generation? And then also that there was a bill that just passed in Congress, H.R. 590, which is a bill that calls for the modernization of these plants.
Okay.
So that's it.
You got a lot in there. Go ahead.
Keith Hsu, the last person, actually asked many of my questions for me.
Yeah.
But I did want to expand upon the last question.
Just a real quick question, though, please.
Relating to not only Indian Point, but the future of New York's other upstate reactors, because as we know, the governor has taken a very different position on Indian Point versus those other facilities.
Okay, thank you. And sir, you're the last one in the room.
Mr. Hussain, thanks for the discussion. Question, I think you mentioned risk versus perception of risk and education versus dialogue. Could you, I mean, the risk of a shark attack is a lot lower than the perception of risk of shark attack. So could you elaborate a bit more on countries or places where they've done that more effectively on how to educate or engage people in a way that makes sense?
Great, thank you for that. And fortuitously, the last question I had online was also about the panel's thoughts on state efforts to use around-market solutions to save nuclear, which ties in, I think, a little bit to the question about Indian Point and other places. The question specifically identifies New York State as well as Illinois. So I'll just open up all those questions to the panel and go through our list. So go ahead, Andy.
Those are very complicated questions and impossible to answer in 1 minute, but let me just roll quickly through them. The decision to shut down Indian Point, I think, was a political one. Too much pressure, too close to New York. They should have been kept running just like the upstate plants were. In terms of education versus dialogue, the best example I have is Finland and Sweden, where they both agreed to build a repository near their existing nuclear power plants in geological formations. And I think there was one thing about reprocessing fourth generation. That's co-locating a reprocessing plant with a nuclear plant is a difficult process. It'll probably have to be a fast reactor to do that. And we had a program called IFR, which was canceled again politically. My bottom line is all this depends on policy, sound policy decisions, which hopefully our work has hopefully will inform so they make the right ones and not do stupid piecemeal solutions.
So one thing about the reprocessing of the fourth generation nuclear plants, whether we reprocess or we don't reprocess, we're still going to need a deep geological repository for some of the wastes that are left. It's not a zero-sum gain. If you reprocess, you're not going to get every bit of everything. Just the recovery factors, if you reprocess, there's going to be material in the waste still yet that you're going to have to do something with and keep it away from people. Andy mentioned Finland and Sweden. You'll notice in Sweden that the two locations, Forsmark and Oskarshamn, were both large nuclear plant regions. So they kind of started, they started with a community and a workforce that understood and had already accepted what they were doing. So that was the thing. I think that the zero emission credits are the way to go for states. I think that the nuclear plants ought to get credit for it, and they ought to also get credit for the fact that they, in the world of renewables, and they're fluctuating, not baseload. They're not baseload. I think nuclear should get credit for being a nice steady baseload that's non-carbon emitting.
Thank you, Tim. Nicola?
I'll leave it to Trish, I guess.
Wonderful. Trish?
Oh, sure, okay, I'll be very brief. I agree with Andy that the shutting of Indian Point was more related to its proximity to New York City than anything else. And just finally, I'm going to say that I thought the Canadian example that I mentioned was a good example of a public engagement. And I think that engagement focused not just on what are the potential risks associated with living next to a nuclear repository, it also focused on what are the benefits. Because we've heard with the questions before, there are jobs that are created, there are skill sets that are developed, there are economic opportunities for communities that choose to host such facilities.
And there may even be geopolitical benefits as well, and that go even beyond our borders. Well, thank you again very much for joining us here today. As I mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. You can also subscribe to our podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms. This is one of a number of great events that we're hosting in the coming weeks. Upcoming events also include the role of Europe in the global energy transition on Tuesday, April 4th, from 9:30 in the morning to 11 a.m. at the Faculty House here at Columbia, as well as the 2017 Columbia Global Energy Summit, which is our annual big conference here, which will be on Thursday, April 13th from 1 to 6 p.m. at the Low Library, again here at Columbia University. We hope to see you again soon, and please join me in thanking Andy, Tim, Nicola, and Trish one more time.